They came down on a Wednesday, and the sky screamed like it had never learned how to whisper. Patrol Commander Vess Catherine felt the drop shuttle shudder as it broke atmosphere, and through the forward viewport, he watched the clouds peel apart like skin off a fruit. Below them, a green and brown quilt of a world unrolled itself. Rivers stitched between hills, a checkerboard of fields, a water tower with faded paint. Nothing about it screamed danger. That was the first mistake, though nobody knew it yet. The reclamation fleet Ashkarvoth was not a subtle instrument. 11,000 ships. 100 worlds broken to its will before this one. Its shadow alone had ended 3 insurgencies without a single shot fired, because when something that big blots out your sun, most species do the math and surrender. The math had always worked. The math was about to meet a variable it had never accounted for. A Tuesday night poker game, a feed store with a bell over the door, and an old woman named Ruth Calloway, who kept a shotgun loaded with rock salt behind her porch swing because the raccoons had been getting bold. Vess watched the town come into focus on his tactical display. Population, 412, give or take, a cluster of buildings around a crossroads, a church with a white steeple, a grain silo, a sign, hand-painted, reading, "Welcome to Hollis Creek." Pop. 412, home of the 1987 state champion 4-H hog judging team. He didn't know what a hog was. He didn't know what 4-H meant. He filed it under irrelevant and moved on because the Voth doctrine was clear. Overwhelming force negates the need for cultural understanding. You didn't need to know a species' poetry to conquer it. You just needed to know where its power plants were. That, too, would turn out to be wrong. The shuttle set down in Pete Calloway's back 40, flattening a stand of soybeans that Pete had been quietly proud of. And the first thing the invaders noticed, the very first thing before the weapons checks, before the perimeter sweep, was the silence. Not the silence of fear. The silence of a place that simply had not yet decided to be afraid. Somewhere behind a stand of oaks, a dog barked twice and then stopped, like it had made its point and didn't need to belabor it. The Voth were not fools. Whatever the humans would later joke about around campfires that shouldn't have been lit within sniper range of a wood line. They were, and it didn't matter, and that itself should have been a clue. They were disciplined to the point of ritual. Every soldier of the Ashkar Voth carried a service blade passed down through 3 generations of conquest, engraved with the names of worlds taken. Their armor drank incoming fire and spat back plasma hot enough to glass sand. Their scout drones could read a heartbeat through 6 inches of reinforced concrete. They had beaten empires. They had toppled orbital defense grids that could vaporize moons. And they had never, not once, in 400 years of expansion, encountered a species that treated an alien invasion as primarily an inconvenience to the harvest schedule. Vess Catherine had been a patrol commander for 11 cycles. He had seen surrender come in every flavor, the weeping kind, the defiant kind, the kind where an entire planetary senate simply stopped answering hails because there was nothing left to say. He had a system for reading a species' collapse point, a whole internal taxonomy built on a career of watching civilizations fold. He looked at Hollis Creek's crossroads, its grain silo, its little brick post office with the flag hanging still in the windless morning, and he thought, this will take an afternoon. That thought would follow him around for the rest of his life, which, as it turned out, was going to be considerably shorter than he'd planned, and considerably stranger. The order came down at 0700 local. Establish perimeter, secure the population center, identify command infrastructure, broadcast the terms. Standard doctrine, the same 11-point checklist that had worked from the ice moons of Kryvex to the floating cities of Baloran Prime. Vess split his patrol into 3 teams. First team took the church, on the theory that religious infrastructure often doubled as civic infrastructure. A reasonable inference, actually, and one of the last reasonable things that would happen to any of them that week. Second team took the feed store, a low building with a rusted tin roof and a bell over the door that jingled with an innocence that felt, in hindsight, almost like a taunt. Third team, Vess's own, moved toward what the scout drones identified as the highest concentration of structural mass. The Hollis Creek Volunteer Fire Department doubling that week, as it happened, as the venue for the town's bi-weekly potluck supper. The old woman was the first human any of them spoke to. Her name was Ruth Calloway. 78 years old, and she was sitting on her porch when the shadow of the drop shuttle passed over her house, and she did not go inside. She had lived through a tornado in '74 that took the roof off the Baptist church, a flood in '93 that put 4 feet of water in the sanctuary of that same rebuilt church, and 31 years of marriage to a man who snored like a diesel engine with a bad clutch, and she had developed, over the accumulated weight of all of it, a philosophy that could be summarized as, the sky does what the sky does, and you deal with it after your coffee's done. She watched 2 Voth soldiers approach her porch steps, 7 feet tall apiece, plated in dark ceramic armor, their weapons humming with a low blue light. And she looked at them the way she might have looked at a stray dog that had wandered into her yard. Not unkind, just assessing. "Well," she said, and took a sip of her coffee. "Y'all figure on staying for lunch, or is this a drive-by?" The lead soldier, his name, translated roughly, was something like Threll, had a universal translator grafted into his jaw, standard Voth field equipment, capable of parsing over 4,000 known languages within the first 90 seconds of exposure. It had never failed him. It failed him now. Not because it couldn't translate the words, because it couldn't translate the tone. There was no fear in the audio signature. No supplication. No hostility, even. Just the mildly put-upon patience of a woman whose Wednesday had been interrupted. Threll's readout blinked an error he'd never seen before. Emotional subtext, unresolved. "Ma'am," he said through the translator in a voice that came out flat and slightly metallic, "you are instructed to remain calm. This world has been claimed under Reclamation Protocol 9. Resistance will be what, sugar?" He paused. The translator did not have a good match for sugar in this context and simply repeated it back. "Met with lethal force," Threll finished, though he found himself, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, saying it a little more gently than the protocol script suggested. Ruth Calloway looked at him for a long moment, set her mug down on the porch rail, and said, "Well, you tell your commanding officer that Ruth Calloway said the church potluck starts at 6, and if you boys are going to be squatting on our land, the least you can do is bring a dish." Then she went inside to call her son. Threll stood on the porch for 4 full seconds, an eternity in Voth tactical timing, trying to determine whether he had just been threatened, mocked, or genuinely invited to a communal meal. His training had a protocol for every human response he'd been briefed on. It did not have one for this. He reported the exchange up the chain as target displayed anomalous non-standard affect, which was as close as military jargon could get to the truth, which was that an old woman in a housecoat had made him feel, for the first time in 11 years of conquest, faintly ridiculous. That was mistake number 2. Nobody was counting yet. They would be, soon. By mid-morning, the town of Hollis Creek had, in the collective and largely unspoken agreement of 412 people, decided on a strategy, and the strategy was this. Act normal, buy time, figure it out at the fire hall tonight. It is worth pausing here to understand something about small towns that the Ashkar Voth, for all their conquered worlds, did not understand, and could not have been briefed on, because it isn't the kind of thing that shows up in orbital scans. A small town is not 412 individuals. It is one organism with 412 nerve endings, and when you step on one of them, the whole body knows within the hour. By the time the second Voth patrol reached the feed store, every soul in Hollis Creek already knew there were aliens in the soybean field, that they'd talked to Ruth Calloway like she was somebody's confused grandmother, and that Pete Calloway was spitting mad about his crop. Bill Tenney, who ran the feed store, had been in the National Guard for 6 years, and had, more relevantly, spent 41 years selling ammunition, fence wire, rat poison, and agricultural chemicals to a rural county that solved most of its problems itself, because the sheriff's department covered 1,100 square miles with 4 deputies, and you learned real quick not to wait on somebody else to handle your business. When the 2 Voth soldiers walked through his door, ducking because the frame wasn't built for 7-foot invaders, the bell above it gave its cheerful little jingle, and Bill Tenney looked up from behind the counter and said, "Help you find something?" The lead soldier's translator parsed this as either genuine commercial inquiry or elaborate mockery, and again could not resolve which. "We are conducting a survey of local infrastructure," it said. You will comply with questioning." "Sure thing," Bill said. "Question away." He did not stop restocking the shelf behind him, which held, among other things, 40-pound bags of a particular anhydrous compound that farmers used for soil treatment, and that, in different proportions, had other applications entirely, applications that were about to become extremely relevant. He answered every question with a flat, folksy honesty that gave away nothing useful, and wasted exactly enough time. "Where's your water source? How many buildings? What's your population? Who's in charge?" That by the time the patrol left, satisfied that Hollis Creek was a harmless agricultural backwater with a chatty proprietor, the mayor had already called an emergency town meeting for 6 o'clock, same time as the potluck, because nobody was going to let good casseroles go to waste on account of an invasion. Here's the thing about the Voth intelligence-gathering doctrine, the thing that would eventually get written up, badly, incompletely, with several key details omitted for morale purposes, in a report that a very different kind of commander would read 6 weeks later with his jaw slowly going slack. It assumed that a population under threat behaves predictably. Fear compresses decision-making. Fear makes people transparent. Every world the Voth had ever taken had confirmed this, right up until the moment their scout drones recorded 412 human heat signatures converging on a single building at 1800 hours, and classified it, with what would later seem like tragicomic understatement, as a gathering, possibly religious in nature, low-threat priority. It was religious in the sense that ham loaf and prayer sometimes occupy the same folding table. It was not low threat. The first blood came at 1400 hours, and it came, as these things so often do, out of something almost domestic. A 3-man Voth patrol, Thrells, as it happened, still nursing a bruised sense of dignity from the porch encounter, was conducting what the mission brief called a residential compliance sweep, moving house to house along Route 9 to catalog structures and confirm no organized resistance was forming. The houses were quiet, curtains drawn in the particular way that meant somebody was home and didn't want you to know it, though the Voth, still calibrating to human behavior, read this as simple absence. They reached the Whitfield place, a low farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a smokehouse out back, and found the front door standing open. An anomaly, a deviation, the kind of thing that in Voth doctrine should have triggered immediate caution. Threll's readout flagged it. He moved forward anyway, because the day had already made him feel foolish once, and some small, unexamined part of him wanted the sweep to go clean. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and something savory, a pot left simmering on a stove that ran on propane the Voth sensors couldn't quite categorize. The living room was ordinary, a recliner, a television, dark, photographs on the wall. 3 generations of Whitfields in Sunday clothes, a young man in an old military uniform that wasn't Voth make but bore, in its way, the same weight. It was, Threll would think later, an almost unbearably normal room, and normalcy was the thing the Voth had never learned to read as a weapon. The second soldier called out that the kitchen was clear. The third found the cellar door, and that was when the ambush closed, and Threll's afternoon and his squad, and the entire operational tempo of the Ashkar Voth's ground campaign came apart in about 11 seconds. Tripwire first. A thin steel line strung ankle height across the cellar threshold, connected to nothing more sophisticated than a shotgun shell rigged into a length of pipe, a design so old it predated the Whitfield family's memory of who'd first built one. Passed down the way a recipe gets passed down, useful knowledge disguised as folklore. It took the third soldier's leg out from under him in a spray of buckshot and ceramic shrapnel, and before the other 2 could process the noise, before their armor's threat assessment had even finished rendering a response, the real attack came from above. 2 men on the second floor, hunting rifles they'd owned since before their kids were born, firing not at the armor. They weren't fool enough for that, not on the first day. Not before they knew what the armor could take, but at the narrow gap at the throat where the plating didn't quite meet, a gap the Voth themselves probably didn't know was visible from a steep enough angle, because nobody had ever been able to get a steep enough angle on a Voth soldier before. Nobody had ever hunted one from a hayloft. Threll went down first. The second soldier lasted 4 seconds longer, long enough to get a distress beacon half-transmitted, a burst of garbled telemetry that would reach the orbital command ship as nothing more than a spike of static, easily dismissed, easily misread. Comm interference, atmospheric noise, nothing to escalate over. That misread would cost the Voth the war. Nobody knew it yet. That was how all the best mistakes worked. What the second patrol found, when they came looking 3 hours later after contact went silent, was the thing that would end up in every account of Hollis Creek that ever got told around a fire or a bar or a debrief table for the rest of that century. They found the smokehouse. The Whitfields had a smokehouse out behind the barn, cedar-planked, blackened inside from generations of hickory smoke, the kind of structure built for curing venison and hams through a long winter. And hanging inside it now, alongside 2 sides of actual pork shoulder that Emma Whitfield had refused to let go to waste on principle, was Threll. Not Threll's body exactly. What was left? Mounted. Actually mounted. On a wooden frame, the way the Whitfields mounted deer heads in the den, antlers and all, a family tradition going back to a grandfather who'd shot the 12-point buck that still hung over the mantel, was the Voth soldier's helmet and the upper plating of his armor, arranged with an almost reverent care on a rack normally reserved for prize bucks, a little hand-lettered card tucked beneath it reading, in Emma Whitfield's careful cursive, "First of the season." The smoke from the hickory fire still curled up through the gaps in the planking when the second patrol found it. Beer cans, empty local brand, crushed flat, sat in a neat row on the smokehouse's outer sill, evidence of the Whitfield boys having sat right there afterward, having a drink, the way you would after a good hunt. The second patrol's report, what survived of it transmitted before that patrol too went dark 40 minutes later near the old grain elevator, described the scene in language that Voth military doctrine had no established vocabulary for. The closest translation anyone ever managed was something like, ritual dominance display, prey classification behavior inverted, recommend reclassification of local population as apex predator, not prey species. Want to know how they did it? You already got a taste. Stick around. It gets worse for the fleet, and a whole lot more interesting for everybody with a folding chair at that 6 o'clock meeting. The Hollis Creek Volunteer Fire Department Hall was not built for war councils. It was built for pancake breakfasts, blood drives, and the occasional wedding reception when the church basement was booked. But at 6 o'clock that evening, with casserole dishes still steaming on the long folding tables at the back, because Doris Kepler had made her green bean thing, and she was not about to let an alien invasion be the reason it went to waste, the hall filled with 411 of the town's 412 residents. Ruth Calloway made 412. She sat in the front row with her coffee thermos and did not look especially alarmed. Mayor Hank Ostrowski, 61 years old, a man who had spent the last decade mostly presiding over arguments about the price of the county fair's Ferris wheel rental, stood at the podium in a flannel shirt with a coffee stain on the pocket and cleared his throat into a microphone that squealed with feedback. "All right," he said. "I know everybody's got questions, and I got about as many answers as a screen door's got walls, but here's what we know. There's aliens. They landed in Pete's soybeans, which, Pete, I am sorry about, and we'll figure out crop insurance later because I genuinely do not know what USDA form covers this. They talked to Ruth like she was going to faint, which, if you know Ruth, you know how that went." Scattered laughter. Ruth raised her thermos in acknowledgement, and they hit the Whitfield place. And the Whitfield boys handled it. Hank continued, and here his voice dropped a register, because everyone in that room understood what handled it meant and what it had cost. Not the invaders' cost, but a cost of another kind. The kind that sits behind a person's eyes for years after they've done something necessary and violent for the first time. "Emma, you doing all right, hun?" Emma Whitfield in the third row nodded once, tight-lipped, and her husband put a hand on her shoulder. "Now," Hank said, "far as I can tell, and Bill can back me up on this since he had 2 of them standing in his store this morning asking dumbass questions, these things are strong, real strong. Guns don't do much against that armor, less you get a good angle, close-range throat gap. They fly ships that could probably turn the whole county to glass if they wanted to. So the smart money says we're outgunned about as bad as outgunned gets." He let that sit a second. "But here's the thing," he said. "They don't know this land. They don't know these woods. They don't know that Earl Bickford's got sinkholes on his back 40 that'll swallow a tractor, let alone a squad of them in heavy armor. They don't know which creek beds flash flood in a hard rain, and I'd bet good money they don't check the weather. They don't know that half this county's got deer stands built into trees they can't even see from ground level. And most importantly, he paused, and a smile crept in that had a little too much teeth in it for a Sunday school mayor. They don't know that every single one of us has been hunting something in these woods since we were about knee-high to a grasshopper. We got more ammo per capita in this county than the state of Delaware's got people. Ain't a one of us that doesn't have a rifle, and most of us got 3. Damn straight, someone hollered from the back, and Hank didn't even bother correcting the language in front of the church crowd, because this didn't feel like the night for it. Old Earl Bickford stood up from his folding chair, cane in hand, and said what would become, in the retelling over the following weeks, something close to a founding document. "Way I see it," Earl said, in a voice like a gravel road, "these fellas conquered 100 worlds by showing up big and scary and letting folks surrender out of fear. Ain't none of us afraid of the woods at night. Hell, most of us are more afraid of what's in Doris's green bean casserole." Laughter, real laughter, the kind that breaks tension like a fever finally sweating out. They come from the sky. We come from right here. And I'll tell you something my daddy told me. You don't corner a possum unless you're ready for what a possum's willing to do about it. There was a rustle of agreement, boots shuffling, someone in the back saying, low but audible, "We got more ammo," and someone else answering, "Hell yeah, we do." And that phrase, "We got more ammo," would end up, weeks later, spray-painted on a piece of plywood nailed to a fence post out on Route 9. A bit of gallows humor graffiti that outlasted the occupation itself. Here's an interlude worth sitting with, because not every minute of that night was war planning. Somewhere around 7:40, in the middle of Deputy Cal Rieger sketching out a rough map of the county's back roads and where a heavy Voth transport could and couldn't go without bogging an axle, 16-year-old Katie Ostrowski, the mayor's granddaughter, raised her hand and asked, with total seriousness, whether the invasion meant she could skip her geometry test on Friday. There was a beat of silence, and then Hank Ostrowski, without missing a rhythm, said, "Katie Ann, if Mrs. Fenwick is fool enough to hold class Friday with alien war machines parked in a soybean field, you tell her your grandpa says the test can wait, but I would not put it past that woman." The room laughed hard enough that the fire hall's old rafters seemed to settle with it, and for about 90 seconds, in the middle of everything, Hollis Creek was just Hollis Creek again, a place where the biggest worry, right up until yesterday, had been a geometry test and whether the county fair Ferris wheel was going to pass inspection. Then Hank cleared his throat, and the room went back to war. There was a moment, though, before the maps came out, where the room did something that no Voth briefing document would ever have predicted, and it's worth lingering on because it explains more about how this whole thing ended than any tactical detail does. Pastor Whitcomb, who ran the Baptist Church first team, had secured that morning without incident, because there was nothing in it to secure except hymnals and a coffee urn, stood up in his shirt sleeves, no collar, and said he wanted to pray before anybody planned any killing. Nobody laughed. A few people bowed their heads. Vess Catherine, watching later footage of a different meeting on a different night, would never understand this part at all, would never be able to explain to his own command why a species preparing to ambush an occupying force would pause first to ask forgiveness for what they were about to do, and then do it anyway, without hesitation, the next morning. It was, in its way, the most alien thing about the whole encounter, and it was entirely, unmistakably human. The tactical planning that followed was less solemn. Cal Rieger's map had coffee rings on it within 20 minutes. Somebody's kid had drawn a small, remarkably accurate cartoon of an alien getting chased by a rooster in the margin, and nobody made them erase it. Doris Kepler interrupted twice to ask whether the casserole dishes needed to be returned by a certain date, invasion notwithstanding, because she had a system, and Hank Ostrowski, God bless him, answered both times with total seriousness, because you did not mess with Doris's system. Alien apocalypse, or no alien apocalypse. This was the texture of it, grief and dish return policy and prayer, and gallows humor all occupying the same folding table, the way small towns hold everything at once because they have never had the luxury of holding only one thing at a time. The plan that came together over the next 2 hours wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd find in a Voth tactical manual, because it wasn't built on force projection or superior firepower. It was built on the accumulated generational knowledge of 411 people who knew, in their bones, exactly what this particular stretch of land could do to something that didn't respect it. They rigged the low bridge over Miller's Creek to collapse under sustained weight, the same way farmers had been fixing that bridge with duct tape logic for 30 years, except this time, the collapse was the point. They flooded 2 of Earl Bickford's sinkholes with brush and leaf litter until they looked like solid ground. The same trick generations of local kids had used to build traps for each other as a game, except this time the game had teeth. They pulled every deer stand in the county into a rough perimeter around the town, elevated blinds that gave hunters, real hunters, people who'd been shooting from tree height at moving targets since before some of the Voth soldiers were decanted, clean lines at that throat gap in the armor. Bill Tenney opened the feed store's back room, where 40 years of just-in-case stockpiling had produced enough ammunition, chemical fertilizer, and rudimentary blasting components to make several federal agencies deeply uncomfortable, had any of them been present to see it. They weren't. That was rather the point of rural America, historically, and it turned out to matter a great deal now. By dawn the next day, Hollis Creek did not look like a town under occupation. It looked like a town going about its business. Kids playing near the tree line, actually serving as spotters. A tractor stuck in the mud at the mouth of the county road, actually blocking the only clean approach for heavy transport. Ruth Calloway back on her porch with her coffee, actually watching the drop shuttle's patrol rotations and radioing updates to Cal Rieger's hand-cranked shortwave. Because if there's one thing a woman who's outlived a husband, 2 dogs, and a flood learns to do, it's watch quietly and report accurately. Vess Catherine, meanwhile, was starting to feel something he did not have a clean word for. The 2 lost patrols had been logged as communications failure, low priority, per standing orders, a decision made by a fleet-level analyst 3 systems away who had never set foot on this soft, quiet, deceptively green little world and had no reason yet to think it mattered. But Vess had walked past the feed store that morning and heard, faintly, laughter from inside. Actual laughter, easy and unhurried, from a species that was supposedly under armed occupation, and something in his combat instincts, honed across 11 cycles and 400 worlds, had started, very quietly, to scream. By noon, the screaming had a reason. Third team, 6 soldiers, heavy armor, moving to secure the grain silo that fleet analysis had flagged as a potential command and control node, because it was tall and had good sight lines and, well, it looked important, rolled straight over the mouth of Earl Bickford's biggest sinkhole. The ground didn't just give way. It swallowed. 2 soldiers vanished into a red clay throat 20 feet deep before the other 4 even registered the change in footing, and the 4 who didn't fall found themselves standing in a clearing that had, 10 minutes earlier, looked like solid pasture and had somehow, impossibly, become a kill box because the empty tree line around that pasture had 6 deer stands in it, and 6 deer stands meant 6 rifles, and 6 rifles meant a converging field of fire that didn't care how thick your ceramic plating was once you found the gap. That was their first mistake in a day full of them, assuming that ground truth matched aerial scan data. The scouts had mapped the terrain from orbit. Orbit doesn't see camouflage netting. Orbit doesn't see a sinkhole somebody spent all night flooding with brush to look load-bearing. Orbit sure as hell doesn't see intent. That was their second mistake. Assuming the town's calm meant the town was cowed. It wasn't calm. It was patient. There's a difference, and it's the difference between a species that surrenders and a species that's waiting for you to walk into the barn. By 1500 hours, the low bridge over Miller's Creek collapsed under the weight of a heavy Voth transport carrying reinforcements toward the grain silo engagement, dropping 11 soldiers and 2 vehicles into 8 feet of cold creek water and soft mud that the transport systems had never been designed to extract itself from. The soldiers who climbed out, soaked, disoriented, armor systems glitching from the water intrusion, found themselves face to face with something they had genuinely no protocol for. 3 teenage boys on 4-wheelers, armed with 22 rifles that couldn't have punched through the armor at all, laughing and hollering and leading them on a chase through a cornfield maze that had, until last week, been a perfectly innocent seasonal attraction for the county fair, The kind of thing families paid $8 to get lost in for fun. The Voth soldiers, exhausted, waterlogged, chasing echoing laughter through 8-foot corn walls that all looked identical from the inside, walked directly into a second ambush. Cal Rieger and 4 of his hunting buddies, positioned on a raised feed platform at the maze's center, who had spent that morning refamiliarizing themselves with exactly how many degrees of angle you needed to put a round through that throat gap from above. Question worth asking here, and it's the one Ves Catherine would ask himself over and over in the weeks that followed, lying awake in a bunk that no longer felt as safe as it once had. How do you conquer a species that treats invasion like a hunting season? How do you break the will of a population that doesn't experience your arrival as apocalypse, but as an inconvenience with a shooting window? You don't. That's the short answer. That's the answer written, eventually, in a very different kind of report than the one Ves had expected to file. There is a temptation in telling this story to make it sound tidy, as if every trap sprung clean and every ambush landed exactly as planned, as if Hollis Creek moved through those 5 days like a machine built for exactly this purpose. It didn't. 2 of Earl Bickford's sinkholes never got a single Voth boot near them and just sat there, patiently useless, monuments to a contingency that never came. A rigged propane tank behind the old Sinclair station, wired by Bill Tenney himself to blow if a heavy transport rolled over the access road, went off a full 6 minutes early because a raccoon, the same raccoons Ruth Calloway had been feuding with all spring, tripped the wire chasing a possum, and the only casualty was a great deal of scorched asphalt and Bill's considerable pride. On the 3rd night, in the dark and the confusion and the adrenaline of it, one of Cal Rieger's own cousins put a round through the tailgate of his neighbor's truck, thinking for one gut-lurching second that the shape moving behind it wasn't Tommy Voss coming back from checking a trap line. And the 2 of them didn't speak for a week afterward. Not out of anger exactly, but because some fears don't leave a person's hands steady again right away. War, even a small, strange, 5-day war fought with hunting rifles and farm chemistry against something that fell out of the sky, is not a story that behaves. It behaves like a landscape in a storm, mostly predictable, occasionally not, and entirely uninterested in whether you were ready for the part that wasn't. What made the difference in the end wasn't any single trap or any single shot. It was that Hollis Creek had 411 people who all independently and without needing to be told twice understood the same unspoken rule. You did not wait for someone else to fix it. Ves Catherine's entire doctrine, honed over 400 conquered worlds, was built on the assumption that a population needed a command structure to fight back. A general, a senate, a resistance cell with a chain of command that could be identified, isolated, and removed. Hollis Creek didn't have one. It had 411 separate, stubborn, well-armed people who each individually decided, more or less at the same time, that they were not going to let this happen to their town, and who each knew the same creek beds and the same sinkholes and the same tree stands because they'd grown up hunting the same square mile of woods their whole lives. You cannot decapitate a resistance that has no head. You can only eventually run out of soldiers to send into it. By the 5th day, Hollis Creek's kill count stood at 41 confirmed Voth casualties against 0 human dead, and, notably, 1 dislocated shoulder, Randy Kepler's, from recoil, not enemy action, which became a small point of local pride and an even bigger point of ribbing that Randy would not live down for years. The Oshkar Voth's landing force, originally 200 strong across the 3-team patrol structure and reinforced twice since, had been reduced to a battered remnant clustered around the drop shuttle in Pete Calloway's ruined soybean field, unable to advance, unable to reliably retreat through terrain that had become, functionally, a live minefield of local knowledge, and unable, this was the part that ate at Ves most, to understand why. He called what would be his final debrief from the shuttle's command deck, patched through to the orbital command ship, and the transcript of it, recovered later, translated, studied by military analysts on both sides of the widening galactic conversation about this particular blue-green world, read in its essential parts like this. Command, this is Patrol Commander Ves Catherine, requesting reassessment of Reclamation Protocol 9 as applied to this world. A pause, audible even in the transcript, the sound of a career soldier choosing words he never expected to need. We have encountered a species that does not respond to overwhelming force with fear. They respond to it with preparation, with patience, with what I can only describe as hospitality toward the concept of violence. They invited us to a communal meal on the first day, Command, before the first shot was fired. And then they killed 41 of us with farm equipment, hunting rifles built for animals a fraction our size, and their own knowledge of terrain we mapped from orbit and never once set foot on ourselves before committing forces. Another pause. They do not fight like an army. They fight like a landscape that has decided to defend itself. Recommend immediate reclassification. Do not send further ground forces. Do not send negotiators. If this world must be dealt with, it should be dealt with from orbit at range by people who will never have to walk through those woods. His voice on the recording cracked very slightly on the last word, woods. The kind of crack that 11 cycles of disciplined command voice should have scrubbed out of him and hadn't. Classify humanity, this specific population at minimum, as apex, not prey. Never invade a species that smokes its enemies alongside its dinner and calls it seasoning. Never invade. The line went dead 9 seconds later. Not from enemy action. From an order given 3 systems away by a commander who had never once doubted the math, revoking the mission and recalling every remaining Voth asset off the surface before the humiliation could compound further, before word could spread to other patrol commanders that Reclamation Protocol 9 had met, of all things, a county fair maze and a woman with rock salt in her shotgun. What Vess Catherine felt in the last minutes before the recall order pulled his shuttle off that soft green world for good was not relief. It was something closer to awe, the specific, uncomfortable awe of a predator who has just realized, mid-hunt, that it has badly misjudged its prey's teeth. They left in the dark, quiet as they'd arrived, loud. The drop shuttle's engines a low hum that Ruth Calloway heard from her porch and recognized, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has just watched trouble decide to be somebody else's problem, as the sound of something finally leaving. The banjo started up somewhere around 9 p.m. that night. Wendell Fenwick, who'd played Cripple Creek at every county fair for the last 30 years, and had spent the occupation with his instrument stashed in a root cellar because Wendell believed, with total sincerity, that some things were too important to risk to an invasion. And the sound of it drifted up Route 9 the way it always did in summer, thin and bright and a little out of tune, and for the first time in 5 days it didn't sound like anything except itself. A small town celebrating, badly, joyfully, the way small towns do. The U.S. military reconnaissance team that reached Hollis Creek 11 days later, because word travels strange in a rural county with half its comm towers knocked flat by an alien drop shuttle's ion wash. And it had taken that long for anyone outside the county to even confirm something had happened, let alone what man found a scene that none of their briefing materials had prepared them for. They found a crater where the soybean field had been, scorched black in a wide ring, drop shuttle long gone. They found a collapsed bridge over Miller's Creek that the county had already, with startling efficiency, begun rebuilding using salvaged Voth armor plating as reinforcement, because Bill Tenney had pointed out that the stuff was, functionally, free and indestructible, and nobody argued with free and indestructible. They found 41 confirmed alien casualties logged in a spiral notebook kept by the county coroner, an ordinary man named Dale Pruitt, who had never in his career expected to write cause of death, gunshot, alien, throat gap, angle approx. 40 degrees in his official records, and had done so anyway in the same careful handwriting he used for everything, because that was the job. And in the Whitfield family smokehouse, still hanging on its rack alongside the hams, they found Threll, the lead officer of the recon team, a young captain who had seen combat in 3 different theaters and thought he'd developed a fairly durable stomach for horror. Stood in the doorway of that smokehouse for a long moment, the smell of hickory and something else. Something older and colder, thick in the air, and did not say anything at all. Beneath the mounted armor plate, Emma Whitfield's little card still hung, weathered now by 11 more days of hickory smoke, first of the season. Someone on the recon team, nobody ever officially admitted who, took a photograph of it that would, against every regulation governing classified operational imagery, leak within the month and become, briefly, one of the strangest and most quietly terrifying pieces of internet ephemera the world had ever produced. A mounted alien helmet in a Kentucky smokehouse, hung with the same reverence as a 12-point buck, under a card written in a farm wife's careful cursive. The captain radioed his report up the chain that evening, and it was, by every account that survived, considerably shorter than protocol required. He described the town. He described the crater. He described the smokehouse, briefly, clinically, because there wasn't really a way to describe it any other way and stay employed. And he ended with a line that made it, unofficially, into circulation among every unit that rotated through the region afterward, half joke and half genuine warning, the kind of thing soldiers say to each other in the dark when they want to sound tougher than they feel. Recommend Hollis Creek, Kentucky. Be left the hell alone. Recommend anyone thinking about invading this planet be advised. Check with the locals first. They've had practice. Out on Route 9, on a fence post that had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember, a new sign had gone up sometime in that 11-day gap. Hand-painted, the letters a little uneven, clearly done by someone working fast with what they had on hand. It read, "Welcome to Hollis Creek, Pop. 412, give or take. Second place for the 1987 state champion 4-H hog judging team, undefeated against everything else." Beneath it, someone had added in smaller letters, almost as an afterthought, "We got more ammo." And somewhere out past the tree line, where the deer stands still stood empty in the summer heat, and the corn maze had already been quietly, deliberately left standing instead of harvested, just in case, Earl Bickford said, just in case. The banjo picked up again in the evenings, the same 3 songs it always played, drifting thin and bright across a soybean field that had, for exactly 5 days, been the front line of a war 11,000 ships couldn't win. Nobody in Hollis Creek ever did find out, not for certain, whether the Ashkar Voth would come back. The recon captain's report went up the chain and came back down, weeks later, stamped with a classification level nobody in the county had clearance to read. And Mayor Hank Ostrowski, when a reporter finally tracked him down for comment, just shrugged and said the thing that ended up on the front page of 3 different papers and eventually, carved in small letters onto a little plaque outside the rebuilt fire hall. "They'll come back if they come back. We'll be here. We're always here." But late at night, if you drive out past the Whitfield place, past the smokehouse that Emma still uses, past Bill Tenney's feed store with its bell still jingling over the door, you can sometimes catch a flicker of light in the sky where there shouldn't be one, high up, moving wrong for a satellite, gone before you can be sure you saw it at all. And down on Ruth Calloway's porch, where the coffee's always on and the shotgun's always loaded with rock salt just in case, she says she's not worried. She says she's just waiting to see what they bring for the potluck next time.